Welcome back to our discussion of Mark's Gospel, and I want to pick up on a theme in particular of Mark's way of structuring his Gospel in works of Christ that can be paired with some of his teachings. But before we do that, though, we have not to this point done any discussion on the selection of Jesus' disciples. There are 4 lists of Jesus' disciples: Matthew and Mark, Luke's, and then John's. John's is very incomplete. If it can be called a list at all, there are only 7 mentioned disciples in John's telling. Only 7 names are mentioned. So there's no list in John's Gospel. It doesn't mean that John didn't believe that there were 12 disciples. It merely means that it wasn't important for him, or at least as important as it was for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to include all of those names. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have virtually the same list, but there are some slight variations, and I think we should take a few minutes to go over those. Let's take a look at Mark chapter 3, verse 13. Now Jesus is going to go up to a mountain, but this time it's not to teach, as in Matthew. It's to call unto him his disciples. He ordained 12, that they should be with him, and that he might send them forth to preach. And the word send, the verb send, is the Greek word apostolein, where we get the word apostles in its noun form. To send. So there is an ordination of 12, and then there's an implicit reference to them being apostles. Luke's Gospel is going to make this explicit and call them actually at this point apostles, disciples who are apostles. Mark is using the term apostolein in a much less technical sense. It seems that later on they were called apostles, and by the time Luke was writing his gospel. But when Mark is writing the gospel, according probably to Peter's dictation, they're not thinking of themselves as this technical group of apostles. Not yet at this point. The word is more functional at this point. It means to be sent. Okay, he ordained 12 that they should be with him, that they might be sent forth to preach and to have power to heal sickness and to cast out devils. And here's the list. Simon, he's surnamed Peter. James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James. So our first 3 names, Simon, and then James, and then John. All right, so the preeminent apostle in all 4 Gospels really it's Peter, and he's usually the first one, or the first named disciple in any Gospel account. And then James and John references these brothers. They are they're called Boanerges, the sons of thunder, sons of Zebedee. Then the next 3, Andrew, Philip, and Bartholomew. Okay, we don't know too much about Bartholomew, and we don't know much about Matthew, who heads up the next set of 3. Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus. And then we have the final 3, Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, Judas Iscariot. Let's go through these 4 sets of 3. The first, Simon surnamed Peter. Simon is an old, established Hebrew name. It goes all the way back to one of the sons of Jacob, one of the tribes of Israel. It's called they were the tribe of Simeon. Simon has that name already, and it's also the name Simon has been made important in fairly recent history during the Maccabean period. Jesus, however, calls him Peter. And Peter is in Aramaic, Kepha. And Kepha is a word for rock. And there's a reference to this, a pun upon his name It's embedded in Matthew chapter 16, upon this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Okay, the second and third name, James, son of Zebedee, and John, there's a special reference here to them being the sons of Zebedee, but also something that may have a reference to their personalities, sons of thunder. Now, that could mean that they were quick-tempered. It could mean that they were horrific to see in some kind of a skirmish. Or it could simply mean that they were remembered in Christian history as being particularly striking disciples. Remember, James is going to be the very first apostolic martyr. John is going to be the very last apostolic, and last apostolic martyr, and he doesn't die the death of a martyr, but he is exiled to Patmos, and he, of course, is known to history as John the Revelator. So I don't know necessarily that these are sons of thunder in the sense that they had a terrible temper, although we will see a glimpse of that in Mark's Gospel, where James and John both ask for Jesus to call down fire upon the Samaritan village for rejecting Jesus. Interesting that they didn't ask Jesus to call down fire on Jerusalem. But on the Samaritans, they had very little sympathy for those people. So there's maybe a little hint of thunder, I would say, but I think it has more to do with how Christian history remembered them. Then we have a reference to Andrew, Philip, and Bartholomew. Nothing much said. We do know that Andrew in the Gospels is going to lead Peter to Jesus. Also, Andrew is going to be responsible for leading the child with the loaves and fishes to Jesus for Jesus to bless. So he plays a very large role in a couple of narratives, but very little is said about him. And he's the one that led Peter to Jesus. He's responsible for all of that. So people that might not get mentioned much can play incredible roles in the people they lead to Christ. And we see that in Andrew's testimony. A word or two about Philip. Philip doesn't have much to say in the Synoptic Gospels. In John's Gospel, he does have a few lines. He's always asking Jesus questions, and he's great for readers because he asks the questions that readers want to know answers to. They are the very questions that readers have foremost in mind, and Philip is the one who asks them. There's another apostolic figure later on in the Christian tradition. This is Philip, who goes and preaches to Samaria, and he also witnesses to the Ethiopian eunuch. That name is important to early Christians. Bartholomew. We know next to nothing about this figure outside of what Christian history tells us. Nothing in scriptures about him, but that name was important because he's in the lists. And his name, Bartholomew, we're not quite sure whether this is a Hebrew name or a Greek name or some combination of the two. Whenever a name begins with bar, that usually means it's Aramaic, meaning son of. And then Tholomew, we're not quite sure what that word means necessarily. Or this could be, like I said, a combination of Aramaic and Greek. It could have originally been son of Ptolemy. Ptolemy would have been a Greek name. The Ptolemies were kings of Egypt at this time. And so he may have had an Egyptian background of some kind. Then we have Thomas. Thomas plays a great big role in the gospel according to John. And he plays a huge role in later Christian history. He is misunderstood later on, it seems, and a gospel had been written, what's called an apocryphal or pseudepigraphal gospel, supposedly written by Thomas later on, that contained kind of a Gnostic version of Jesus. And for whatever reason, Thomas's name was attached to that, probably because, according to Christian tradition, Thomas traveled to Edessa, which is in the east, and then on to India, where there was kind of supposedly a Hindu influence upon him. And so the Gnostics said that he brought back with him light from the east. Quite a bit of nonsense all wrapped up in that, but the Gospels have nothing to say about any of that. Thomas, in fact, calls Jesus my Lord and my God, the greatest of all of the confessions of any of the disciples in the Gospels. It belongs to Thomas. James, the son of Alphaeus, we know next to nothing of him, except there's the patronymic, son of Alphaeus. In Matthew's Gospel, instead of the name Matthew, we have the name Levi. And he is called Levi, son of Alphaeus. So it could well be that Levi and James, the son of Alphaeus, they're both brothers. They could be brothers. So we're not sure about that. And also, we're pretty sure that Levi and Matthew are the same person. And there are quite a few reasons for that. I don't have time to go into it. Nevertheless, moving on, Thaddeus and Simon the Canaanite. Now, Thaddeus is not mentioned in John's Gospel. And he's also not mentioned in one of the Synoptic Gospels. There's another name instead. The name is Judas. There are two Judases according to another Gospel account. And the name Thaddeus isn't in there. What's going on here? Do we have a poor memory of who exactly the disciples were? I mean, for these being such important figures, can't these four Gospels get on the same page? And especially if Matthew and Luke they have access to Mark's Gospel, because perhaps it goes back to Peter, why can't they get these lists right? Well, please understand, again, the Gospels were written to different audiences, scattered throughout the ancient world of the first century. And there are different names for some of these apostles in different areas. For instance, the Apostle Paul always calls Peter Kepha, okay? But in other places, he's called Petrus. He's not by Paul, but he's called Petrus, Peter. These are translations of the same name, but two different names. He also has the name Simon, and he has the name Peter. And then he has that Aramaic combination of Kepha. We have to understand that oftentimes in the Mediterranean world, people would have a Greek name and a Hebrew name. Okay? The ancient Mediterranean world was a very cosmopolitan area of the world where people were coming and going from all over the Mediterranean. And so one of the ways to signify or identify a particular individual was to name where that person was from, who that person's father was, and also oftentimes the lingua franca is at this time Koine Greek. So almost everybody speaks Greek. So oftentimes a man would have a Greek name, and he would have his own native name, his own given name, in addition to a patronymic and then maybe even a place where he's from. So, for instance, I think that would help us understand who maybe Thaddeus is. Thaddeus is, it seems, a Greek name. Thaddeus is a combination of perhaps two different names. It's Thea, which is the Greek word for God, and then Dios, which can itself either be a Greek name for God, but more likely a name for gift. Okay? So the name Thaddeus probably means gift of God. Okay? In Greek. Now, there's a figure in John's Gospel who's one of the disciples of Jesus, and he's very important. His name's Nathaniel. But he's not mentioned in these synoptic lists. Why is Nathaniel so prominent in John's Gospel, but absolutely absent in the synoptics? Well, it is my opinion and the opinion of others. Again, all of this is theory, but I think it's pretty well-informed theory that the name Thaddeus is the Greek version of the Hebrew name Nathaniel. And the reason why I say that is because the Hebrew word Nathan means gift, and El means of God. So you have Thaddeus, which means gift of God, and you have Nathaniel, which means gift of God. So it just seems that we have one man with two different names, Greek and Hebrew. Now, Simon the Canaanite could have had, he could have also been known as a Judah or Judas, since there, according to the other Gospels, there's a second Judas, not named Iscariot. Usually you didn't carry around two different Hebrew names. That's not typically the practice. So this could have been the name of one of the other, a surname or a second name of one of the other apostles. So I said all that to say this. If you ever encounter someone who has a problem with the historicity and the veracity of the Gospels based on what appears to be a disagreement between the lists of apostles or disciples amongst those four for such important figures, please understand we're talking about a very different place and time. Today in our very journalistic society, we don't always write down, our journalists don't always write down facts. In fact, the media can be very interpretive in its reportage. But still, we have this emphasis in journalism upon date, time, location, exact names. We can be very precise that way. But in ancient times, this was not necessarily the case. Names were used that were important for a given location. Okay, so in a Greek-speaking area, it might be important to use the name Paul, for instance, even though his given name is Saul. He doesn't go by Saul, though, in Greek lands, Greek-speaking, primarily Greek ethnic lands. But when he's in Israel, he's called Saul. Okay, so please take that into consideration. Now, I said a moment ago that I wanted to talk about Mark's habit of using pairings in his gospel to structure his narrative sequence. Okay, let's begin with chapter 3 and verse 20, right after the naming of these disciples. And the multitude cometh together again, so that they could not so much as eat bread. And when his friends heard of it, they went out to lay hold on him. For they said, Jesus' friends, he is beside himself. In other words, he's gone crazy. He's going to kill himself. Everywhere he's going, he's being absolutely overwhelmed. And you remember from the previous lecture, this is going to be so overwhelming for him that indeed in his humanity, this is going to completely tax his humanity to the point of collapse. His friends try to rescue him from this early. He's gone overboard. This is too much. The scribes which came down, now I want you to notice, the scribes came down from Jerusalem and they said, now the friends have said he's beside himself. That was a kind way of saying this is too much. But the scribes, having less sympathy for him, come down and say, he hath Beelzebub. By the prince of the devils, he casts out these devils. Which, of course, makes no sense at all. But nevertheless, there's the accusation. And Jesus called unto them and said unto them in parables, how can Satan cast out Satan? And if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. Listen carefully. And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. Okay, really interesting transition right there. First, he's talking about a kingdom. If it's divided against itself, it can't stand. And then he speaks of the oikos, the house. Why does he transition from a discussion of kingdom, where it was perfectly apparent what he was saying? If a kingdom has two different factions in it and they're warring against each other, it can't stand. Why did he need then to draw the analogy down to the level of the house? Well, I think the answer is at the end of this particular pericope. Now, I think I've used that word for the first time here in this lecture series, pericope. It's not to be clever. I'm using the word pericope because it's a technical meaning for a section of a narrative it's a self-contained unit. We get the word coupon from pericope today. It means to cut around. So there's this self-contained unit here that has first the friends trying to get Jesus from overworking himself to the point of collapse. Second, being accused of casting out Satan by Satan, and Jesus responding by saying a house divided against itself cannot stand. And then, please note, at the end of this pericope, we're going to see in verse 31, there came then his brethren and his mother, and standing without, sent unto him, calling him. And the multitude sat about him, and they said unto him, Behold, thy mother and thy brethren without seek for thee. And Jesus answered them, saying, Who is my mother, my brethren? He looked round about on them which sat about them, and said, Behold my mother and my brethren. For whosoever shall do the will of God, the same is my brother and my sister and my mother. Now, here's a fact that's a little bit obscured by most English translations. The friends that tried to take hold upon Jesus in verse 21, okay, are the same group of people that tried to come and rescue Jesus again in verse 31 through 35. His mother and his brothers who are asking for him. Okay, so at the beginning of this pericope, again, the mother and the brothers try to rescue Jesus from himself. And then he ignores this call, and then he's accused of casting out Satan by Satan, and then saying a house divided against itself cannot stand. And then members of his own house are trying continually to bring Jesus away from his ministry right here. So you see what's just happened. The way Mark has put this narrative together, the reason why Jesus would have said a house that's divided against itself cannot stand is because at that same time his own house is questioning his ministry. His house is divided against itself. So this is a word not only to the scribes who had made the accusation about him casting out Satan by Satan, but also this is a response to his mother and his brothers who are trying to separate him from the ministry that he's doing. Yeah, ingenious. That's absolutely ingenious. Second, we're supposed to draw a negative inference about these efforts on the part of Jesus' mother and brothers at this point. They are standing almost simpatico with the scribes who are accusing Jesus of also being crazy enough to cast out Satan by Satan. Okay, now chapters 4 and 5, I've talked a little bit about Jesus sitting on the ship and then standing up and calming the sea. But notice what happens in chapter 5, the very next chapter, after Jesus has calmed the storm upon the sea. They came over onto the other side of the sea and into the country of the Gadarenes. When he was come out of the ship, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. That's an interesting pairing as well. look what Mark has just done. He has placed right next to each other the calming of the sea by Jesus, and also there's about to be a calming of the chaos that's within the life of this man of Gadara. This man's in the tombs, and he has an unclean spirit who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no man could bind him, no, not with chains. Please remember, pay careful attention, where have we just heard this discussion on binding? Just a few moments ago, we heard about Satan can't stand against Satan because that kingdom would fall. What you have to do, Jesus says, and I think it would be best to quote it. Jesus said, if Satan rise up against himself and be divided, he cannot stand, but hath no end, or hath an end. No man can enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods, except he will first bind the strong man, and then he will spoil his house. So there's this discussion of binding the strong man. Now in chapter 5, we see a man who is bound and walking amongst the tombs. He's not bound and walking amongst the tombs. No man can bind him. And he's walking about in the tombs. And not even with chains can you keep this man bound. Okay, so here is a picture of the strong man. Here is a man who is literally the strong man of this house. So we're going to see who the strong man is. Is it going to be this man who has the demoniac? Or is it going to be Jesus? So we get to actually see a narrative or a story or an illustration of how this concept actually works. So you see how Mark has prepared us to see the significance of Jesus casting out the demons out of this strong man. He's done this by this little parable that he told just a little while ago. Now also, if a house is divided against itself, it can't stand. This man is so divided that he has legions within him. A legion of devils. Interesting that Mark uses the term legion. By tradition, Mark was writing to Christians in Rome using Peter's eyewitness. And so you get to see a lot of Latin terminology in Mark's gospel. And this is one of those Latin words. This is not a Greek word. Legion is a specifically Latin word. Okay, and so Mark uses that term here. Now the man, because that he had been bound with fetters and chains, and the chains had been plucked asunder by him, fetters broken in pieces, neither could any man tame him. Always night and day he was in the mountains, the tombs, crying and cutting himself with stones. But when he saw Jesus afar off, he ran and worshipped him. Oh, the strong man has arrived. The true strong man. And cried with a loud voice and said, what have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God, that thou torment me not. I made mention, I think in the last lecture on Matthew, that Caiaphas had actually used very similar verbiage with Jesus. I adjure thee by God, he said. Tell me who you are. Now here, in Mark's gospel, what have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? He does identify him as the Son of God and the Son of El Elyon, the Most High God. I adjure thee that thou torment me not. Very interesting that a demon would have the audacity to appeal to God against Jesus, the Son of the Most High God. Has he just appealed to God to save him from God's own Son? What incredible, enormous stupidity, really. Nevertheless, there it is. The devil here seems to be referring to some kind of a contract have you come to torment me before my time? He knows he's going to be tormented, and he knows that it's just that he'll be tormented. But what he wants to do is appeal to some kind of contract he has with God, that you cannot send your son before my time, as if there's some kind of a prearranged time which the enemy knows. No one else knows, but the enemy knows. You would probably have to read some of the intertestamental literature to understand some of the background that's going on here. In particular, if you really want to know some of the history of some of the ideas that are floating around in Jesus' own day amongst the Jews, you would probably have to read some of the books of the Maccabees. These are not inspired works. These do not belong in the biblical canon, but they are interesting for understanding a little bit about what's going on in the minds and in the hearts and the hopes, the fears of the people of the day. So you would probably need to know something about the book of Maccabees, something about the book of Jubilees. You would probably need to know something about the book of Enoch also, in which there's supposedly a contract between God and the demons. And that seems to be what's being referred to here. We're not quite sure. But anyway, here he is applying to God for help to cast out Jesus. But Jesus has come to cast out him. Come out of the man, says Jesus, thou unclean spirit. And he asked him, what is thy name? And he answered, saying, my name is Legion, for we are many. There's that house divided against itself, and it cannot stand. He besought him much that he would not send them away out of the country. Now there was there nigh unto the mountains a great herd of swine feeding. And all the devils besought him, saying, send us into the swine, that we may enter into them. Interesting that the unclean spirits always seem to be seeking a host of some kind of flesh and blood, even if that host happens to be unclean animals. Unclean animals that they will send furiously into the sea. Forthwith Jesus gave them leave. And the unclean spirits went out and entered into the swine, and the herd ran violently down into a steep place into the sea. They were about 2,000, and they were choked in the sea. I have stood on the banks of the Sea of Galilee, and on the side of what was formerly Gadara. There today, the landscape is of steep banks rising up, and there are actually caves in the banks of the Sea of Galilee, right here on this side of the sea. And you could still to this day stand on the top of those banks and look down and see the basic area, the approximate area in which this narrative would have occurred. And it all makes complete sense. It harmonizes with this telling of Jesus casting out the demons. Now, I want to draw your attention as we bring this lecture to a close, and I think something's going to happen here. I think some light bulbs are going to go on. Something really exciting, I think, is about to happen. But pay close attention. You're going to see something said here that will be echoed later. And when you keep it in memory, try to hold over in memory the things that you read, and then when you come to another place, you'll find that the gospel writer often echoes something that happened earlier. Now watch this. And they came, and they that fed the swine fled and told it in the city and in the country, and they went out to see what it was that was done, and they came to Jesus and to see him that was possessed with the devil, and had the legion. And they saw him sitting, clothed, and in his right mind, and they were afraid. This is I smile in anticipation of what is about to happen here when we turn over to Mark chapter 16. But let's continue the rest of this. And they that saw it told them how it befell to him that was possessed with the devil, and also concerning the swine. And they began to pray Jesus to depart out of the coast. So they want to cast Jesus out. And when he was come into the ship, he that had been possessed with the devil prayed Jesus that he might be with him, be one of his disciples. Howbeit Jesus suffered him not, but saith unto him, Go home to thy friends, or to thy family, and tell them how great things the Lord hath done for thee, and hath had compassion on thee. And he departed and began to publish it in Decapolis. All right. I want to remind you of a few terms, a few ideas before we wrap this up, or we come to the Mark's return to this particular theme. Once again, here is a demoniac, or former demoniac. The demons have been cast out of him. The next time we see him, he is sitting down. He is completely clothed, as opposed to before, where he was walking about the tombs naked. Now he's sitting, and he's clothed, and he's in his right mind. All right, now he's going to ask Jesus if he can be his disciple, and Jesus says to him, Go. Okay, to the would-be disciple, he says, Go. Go home to thy friends and tell how great the things are that the Lord has done for thee. All right, now let's go over to Mark 16 now. Of course, we're skipping over a lot, and we'll come back in the next lecture. But this is fascinating what Mark has done here. Chapter 16, verse 1, And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome had brought sweet spices that they might come and anoint the dead body of Jesus. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. And they said among themselves, Who shall roll away the stone from the door of the sepulchre? And when they looked, they saw that the stone was rolled away, for it was very great. And entering into the sepulchre, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a long white garment, and they were afraid. This is a mirror image of what happened at Gadara. He was sitting, clothed, in his right mind, and the townspeople were afraid. This kind of distinctive fear, this distinctive form of fear, is this fear that's often mentioned in Mark's gospel of something that the Lord has done. It's a marvel at something that the Lord has done. Now, we're not done. Notice now what this young man sitting and clothed and on the right side says. Be not affrighted. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him. But go your way. Tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you into Galilee. There shall ye see him, as he said unto you. Oh my goodness. Not only is this a mirror image in the sense that we have a young man sitting, clothed, and then the people are afraid, but also, he says, the voice says the same thing that Jesus told the demoniac, the former demoniac. He said, Go. He tells the disciples, Go and tell your friends. Okay? So Peter through Mark has a habit of pairing things. So look for pairs. When you see one thing happen, look for it to reappear in another form later on in some way, shape, or form. I have one or two more of these that we should visit. Take a look at 7:31. Oh, I should mention, we're going to see that in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus is arrested, there's going to be a young man who flees away naked. Okay, so he goes in the opposite direction. The demoniac who came to Jesus ends up sitting and clothed in his right mind. The young man who flees Jesus flees and becomes naked. All right, back to 7:31. And again, departing from the coast of Tyre and Sidon, Jesus came unto the Sea of Galilee through the midst of the coast of Decapolis, and they bring unto him one that was deaf and had an impediment in his speech. And they beseech him to put his hand upon him. All right, so we're about to see Jesus perform a miracle upon a deaf and mute. Okay, now, it's really important that you take a few steps back earlier on in the narrative in chapter 7 and look at something that Jesus says in verse 14, 15, and 16. When he had called the people unto him, he said unto them, Hearken unto me, every one of you, and understand, there's nothing from without a man that entering into him can defile a man. But the things which come out of him, those are they that defile the man. And then he has these words, if any man have ears to hear, let him hear. Okay? There's this urgency to hear, to listen carefully. If anyone has ears to hear, that's a call for understanding. And then almost immediately after that, Mark is going to show us Jesus healing a deaf man. And so it is in verse 32, and they bring unto him one that was deaf, had an impediment of speech. He took him aside from the multitude and put his fingers into his ears, and he spit and touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said unto him, Ephphatha, be opened. There's another Aramaism of Jesus. And straightway his ears were opened, and the string of his tongue was loosed, and he spake plain. There's a loosing that has happened again. Another strong man has showed up. And he charged them that they should tell no man. But the more he charged them, so much the more a great deal they published it. He hath done all things well. He maketh both the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. All right, so Mark has paired together a saying of Jesus, urging his disciples that if they have ears to hear, hear, understand, know the significance of this. And then he has opened up the ears of a deaf man, okay? And he has cried out, Ephphatha, be opened. Now, take a look at chapter 8 and verse 18. Now Jesus says, having eyes, you do not see, and having ears, hear ye not, and you do not remember. Okay, this is Jesus taking to task the people for not understanding the miracle of the bread. Having eyes to see, but not seeing. Look what's about to happen in verse 22 now. And Jesus comes to Bethsaida, and they bring him a blind man, and besought him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands upon him, and he asked him if he saw aught, he looked up and said, I see ministries walking. Okay, so he has sight, but he can't see clearly. Now remember, Jesus has said, do you have eyes, but you can't see? Okay? In other words, are you seeing, but you're not quite understanding? You're not really understanding what's the significance of what's going on right here. Well, this is precisely what has happened with this blind man, because Mark has paired a saying about having eyes but not seeing with a man who will have eyes and will see, but sees men as trees. And then Jesus put his hands upon his eyes again for a second touch and made him look up. And he was restored and saw every man clearly. Okay, so this time it took a second touch of Jesus for him to see. Now, my reason for bringing that up is these two instances that are paired together preface the very center of Mark's gospel. We've now come to the center of Mark's gospel. Jesus went out, his disciples, into the towns of Caesarea Philippi. And by the way, he asked his disciples, saying unto them, Whom do men say that I am? And they said, John the Baptist, and some say Elias, and others one of the prophets. And he saith unto them, But whom do you say that I am? And Peter answered, Thou art the Christ. Thou art the Christ. Peter, unlike the other disciples, sees clearly that Jesus is the Christ. But Peter's not done. Peter doesn't really see clearly, because look what happens next. Jesus charged them that they should tell no man of him. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected of the elders and of the chief priests, the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he spake that saying openly, and Peter took Jesus and began to rebuke him. But when he had turned about and looked on his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, Get thee behind me, Satan, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but the things that be of men. All right, so Peter has had a touch from the Lord. He sees that Jesus is the Christ, unlike most others. But he hasn't had a second touch yet, and that's what Peter has to have. Like the blind man before him, he's now seeing trees instead of men. He's seeing a Christ, but not understanding what Christ means at all. All right, so it's going to take all the way to Calvary in the resurrection. It will not be until Calvary that Peter receives this second touch. And then he will understand not just that he's the Christ, but what Christ actually means. And in our next lecture, I want to talk about that a little bit, what Christ really means.